Hi there, and welcome back to my BNSF Marias Pass HO scale layout. In today's video, I'd like to share with you the steps I took to model the tunnels that you'll find in the scene of Belton. I set out to build the tunnels with the simplest methods and supplies possible, and I hope to demonstrate that you can achieve realistic results with simple materials like cardboard, foam, and plaster. Before we get to the construction methods, let's first take a look at my prototype inspiration. There are numerous examples of tunnels along the prototype Marias Pass route, and I opted to model two while exercising a bit of artistic license by incorporating certain elements from other tunnels. The first bore you encounter after climbing the grade past the west entrance to Glacier National Park is Tunnel 4.0. You'll notice many similarities between the real tunnel and my model, but the interesting external bracing that you see on the west end of the tunnel is a feature I borrowed from another prototype tunnel that's located just a couple miles up the grade. This was just too cool of a detail to pass up, and I thought it would look appropriate as a part of my Tunnel 4.0. Just a few hundred scale feet to the left, we find Tunnel 3.9, which is actually modeled after the prototype Tunnel 3.8, which I know is a bit confusing. This is actually the last place that you see trains on the lower level until they reappear on the upper deck, and as such, I only needed to model the east portal because there is no other end of this tunnel. On an interesting historical note, and I mean that in the sense of layout history, this tunnel used to be located on the upper level and represented Belmont Tunnel back when I modeled Crawford Hill in Nebraska. When I changed the setting of the layout, I simply removed the tunnel structure from its original setting, modified it, and relocated it directly underneath where it previously rested. So starting with Tunnel 4.0, the first step was building the tunnel liner to which the portal faces are affixed. One could simply build a dark rectangular cardboard frame or something of the like as the main structure of the tunnel, but to me, I really appreciate seeing the ceiling curvature or vaulting within the tunnel. I thought the easiest way to achieve this vaulting was to use spare pieces of 2-inch thick insulation foam. First, I cut rectangular chunks of foam that would be just large enough to form the tunnel liner. I then used a simple cardboard template that I iteratively taped to the front and back of each foam piece before cutting out the inner profile with a hot knife tool. Now, if you're wondering how I decided what the inner dimensions of the tunnel should be, it wasn't necessarily a very empirical process. I didn't have any sort of prototype or scale dimensions. I simply made some measurements of my biggest and tallest rolling stock and then eyeballed the tunnel profile. So it took a few rounds of trial and error, but I eventually came up with a fitting tunnel profile template. So I simply repeated this until I had enough tunnel pieces to make the bore as long as I was imagining, and then I glued them all together using Liquid Nails Project Adhesive. We'll return to Tunnel 4.0 in a second, but let's look at the liner for Tunnel 3.9. You'll remember that the main tunnel structure of Tunnel 3.9 was already built for an older version of this layout. One of the challenges with this tunnel liner is that it spans a curved piece of track, and trying to curve a curved ceiling can be a bit of a challenge. So for this tunnel, I simply built a cardboard skeleton, lined it with paper and tape, and then plastered the inside of it. I also knew that I wanted a little bit of the tunnel liner exterior to be visible, so I had to modify this original structure by trimming off some of the corners and then filling gaps between the ribs with more cardboard. Similarly, for the foam tunnel liner of Tunnel 4.0, I beveled the corner that faces the aisleway because eventually a significant amount of the liner will be visible. Next, I turned my attention to making the portal faces themselves. For Tunnel 3.9, the most substantial modification was adding a slab along the top of the portal to more closely match the prototype dimensions. For Tunnel 4.0, I had to fabricate the portals from scratch, and I did this once again with cardboard. Again, through trial and error, I eyeballed the best portal I could, made a template, and then carefully cut out the cardboard pieces with a fresh X-Acto blade. For Tunnel 4 alone, I cut out 4 separate portal faces and then hot glued them together in pairs to make them a proper looking thickness. So in other words, each portal face is 2 pieces of cardboard stacked together, cut out in the shape of the portal. Now, I knew that I intended to skim the portals with plaster, so to make them resistant to warping if they absorbed water from the plaster, I painted them with wood glue first, which adds a bit of water resistance during the plaster process. My go-to plaster is a 3M product called Patch Plus Primer, which I believe has been rebranded as Small Hole Repair. It's light, flexible, and easily sandable, so I like to use it for roads, various scenery, work, and structures like retaining walls and tunnels. I spread the plaster on the inside of the liner for tunnel 4.0, and then did the same all over the outside of both liners. The portals received the same treatment, and then I sanded everything down with a drywall sanding block. One important step in all of this was how I approached building the scenery around the tunnels. To make it easy to establish the final tunnel placements with relation to the surrounding scenery, I built the rock formations out of modular blocks of foam that simply fit around and rested on the tunnels. I made sure to carefully mark the final locations of the tunnels with the scenery blocks in place, then removed all of the rocks and continued working on the tunnels. Next, I began work on etching the tunnel lettering along the tops of the portals. Again, the theme of this video is eyeballing, and I once again just tried to freehand mimic the look of the tunnel to the best of my ability. I found that a 0.5mm mechanical pencil was a useful tool for this step. I first lightly marked the lettering in place, and then gradually applied more pressure to create the physical relief in the tunnel face. Not shown is that after the lettering was finished, I glued the portals to the respective tunnel liners using more liquid nails adhesive. Now, I do apologize for this next part because I didn't capture any of the painting action sequences, but I can tell you that I simply used acrylic paints in various browns, grays, and black to emulate the weathering on the respective tunnels. I started with a nearly full-strength flat gray layer and then applied wash layers of paint diluted with tap water to move the coloration in the direction that I wanted. With the tunnels all glued together and painted, it was time to adhere them to the layout. But before doing so, you'll notice that I painted and ballasted the track within the tunnel. Then I triple-checked that my rolling stock with the biggest rolling profiles, such as auto racks and double stacks, could actually make it through the tunnel still. While everything fit just fine, I had to add a foam shim to the outside curve of tunnel 3.9 to visually level the portal. I adhered the tunnels to my layout using more liquid nails, and then did the same with my modular foam blocks. After a day of drying, they were locked in place, and I moved on to other scenery work. Months later, I turned my attention back to the tunnels, and I decided that before adding tunnel details such as signage and piping, I needed to add a bit more weathering to tunnel 4.0 because it just didn't look exactly how I wanted it. So with the tunnel and surrounding scenery in place, I simply beaded some black acrylic paint along the upper edge of the tunnel portal and feathered it downward. After drying, I also added some black AIM weathering powders. Now, up until this point, I haven't really talked about the external bracing that I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, so I'll tell you now that these are also built out of cardboard and plaster, just like the tunnel portals. So after painting them, I added a bit more weathering, just like the portal of tunnel 4.0, and then finally glued them in place with a bit of liquid nails adhesive. If you look at examples of tunnel portals along this route, you'll see all sorts of fine details. So after touching up the weathering and installing the braces, it was time to add some of the finer details like wire conduits and equipment boxes. For For the small equipment boxes, I used bits and pieces from the Walthers Electrical Fixtures Kit. I'll be sure to put the link below so you can find that. I used some loose black wire I had sitting around for the heavier looking conduits, and then to render the smaller gauge loose wire that runs between some of the details, I used heavy black Easy Line, which is a flexible rubber material that's great for modeling an assortment of small details. After painting the small boxes with acrylic paints, I adhered everything using Gorilla Contact Adhesive, which is super tacky and flexible, so if you mess up, you can just rub it off and start over. On the east portal of Tunnel 4.0, I also installed an interesting white antenna using very fine white styrene, and then all the portals received a no trespassing sign that I simply typed up in a Word document, scaled down, and printed out at home. And at that, the tunnels were done. Despite some of the rudimentary methods, I think the results are quite convincing, and regardless of the results, I at least hope you enjoyed this video. So, as always, stay tuned for more videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.